So I'd like to introduce our two speakers. This isn't so much a speaker presentation thing as a Q&A with you about discovering the ins and outs of things to do with nature-based solutions, carbon credits, trees being planted, all that kind of stuff, which is a bit of a mystery to some, including myself to a certain extent. So I'd like to introduce Richard Clarke, and Richard is from Tree Wilder and Highland Carbon, and also like to introduce Mr. Andrew Steele. Andy is from PATT Foundation, and that's the Plant a Tree Today Foundation. We've got an exhibition in Prospect Centre opposite here, which is done by the people involved in working in PATT Foundation. So if you want to find out more about that and see what they can do and watch the videos over there, there's opportunity to do that as well for the next, I think it's running for quite a while after the festival finishes as well, but you could certainly look later after this or tomorrow. So for now, let's get into these questions. I think the first thing to do is, after my dreadful introduction, is that you introduce yourselves and say, you know, in your perspective, what your work is about. Shall we start with Richard?
Hello, I'm Richard. So I'm actually a zoologist. So I've worked in international conservation for many years. And more recently, I worked for the Woodland Trust in their corporate partnerships team. And it's when I was at the trust that the Woodland Carbon Code was set up, and the trust was one of the instigators of that code. So latterly, I've set up a company called Highland Carbon, and we offer climate projects to businesses in the voluntary market, which is for low polluting companies who don't have to get involved in this. They do it to be good company citizens. And latterly, Tree Wilder, which is for individuals. It's the same sort of approach, which is planting forests at scale. So we've got a project in Scotland at Loch Ness, which is the one that's being supported by Tree Wilder. Throughout all of our projects over the last 3 years, we planted somewhere in the region of 4 million trees. And it's typically in wild locations for rare and endangered species to put back nature as it would have been in sort of Roman times. But just to say, that's one kind of project. There's loads of different kinds of tree projects, and they're all important, but this is the sort of thing we're involved with.
Cool. Andy Steele. I set up the PATT Foundation in 2005. Shows you how long we've been involved in this. Talking last night to a few people, and actually attended COP13, which goes back a long way. The name of the charity is PATT Foundation, Plant a Tree Today. So 18 years ago, we thought the simplest solution and action people can take is plant a tree. So those trees now, 18 years later, hopefully have flourished into a woodland. I was fortunate enough to be based in Asia for 18 years, although I am East Hull born and bred, so I'm back home. And I was invited also to sit on the steering group for what was Hayward's at the time. And it's now the Humber Forest, part of the England Community Forests. And the Northern Forest was launched. And literally, I'm a pretty straight shooter. I'm ex-forces. And I'd looked at this problem and thought, well, 50 million trees, how are we going to do it? They're not going to jump in the ground themselves. Looked at the scale of the problem and realized there's a place for people to be active, David, and was it Hannah? There's an element of social isolation, getting the population out, doing things, and that's fantastic. But if you want to do something at speed and at scale, how are we going to tackle this problem? And that's where I married up two elements, which are veterans suffering from mental health and wellness issues, including PTSD. And as we know, just prior to COVID, we now know more effectively after COVID, it was so beneficial to get those guys outside. So we set up the Green Task Force, which is now a delivery partner for Humber Forest, White Rose Forest, and the Mersey Forest. So we've got a team in Warrington, team in Hull, and a team in Cardiff. We're being pulled into Scotland with Glasgow. We focus on trees and training with PATT, and the Green Task Force is training veterans and other people to work in the land-based sector. So the guys cover all aspects, whether it's tree surgery, because woodland management, we do need to cut trees down, fencing, invasives, it's all been rolled into one. Newcastle City Council, the North East Community Forests are trying to get us up there. Northumbria County Council want us up there. So from a small acorn, a great oak tree is growing, and it started in Hull. So thank you.
Richard, What on earth's a carbon credit?
I think the important thing to point out, first of all, is that there's two completely separate carbon markets. There's the mandatory market, which is the one that heavy polluters are in. It's a compliance market and it's a cap and trade market. It's not one that I'm involved with at all. So that would be for companies like concrete, steel, glass production, and so on. And so they're in a cap and trade where they're buying units above a certain floor level on an auction, which is quite a high price. I'm in the voluntary market. So at Highland Carbon, we're in business to business. Tree Wilder, we're in business to consumer. And the businesses that we work with through Highland Carbon, the companies like, we've got a Scotch company, an architect's firm, a fashion brand, and so on. So they're not the sort of companies that come to mind when activists, I think, get concerned about certain things. So these are companies who don't have to do this. So in the voluntary market, we have two official frameworks in the UK for nature-based solutions. One is the Woodland Carbon Code, which is for trees, and the other one is the peatland code, which is for bog restoration. And we work in both of those. So these are the official nature-based solutions that count towards the UK's commitment to the Paris Agreement and the aims that come out of the COP conferences. So it counts towards the UK's commitment. So it's official traceable units that can only be retired once each time one is purchased.
That made some sense to me.
Does it? Okay, good.
How do you know a good project from a bad project?
Well, there's different ways of looking at it. I would say some projects have high biodiversity outputs, some have high social outputs, and some have high environmental outputs. The ideal is where you get some of everything. So our projects, we plant diverse native trees in permanent woodlands. And the one in Loch Ness, for example, it's to benefit red squirrels, golden eagles, ospreys, pine martens, and so on. That project will be there, for many generations after we're all gone. And it's joining up. It's a great example because in that area, there's about 12 other major projects. It's part of what's called the African Highlands. So you've got a number of big NGOs also restoring woodland in that same area. So between all of us, we're filling in a landscape, and that's a good example of a biodiversity project. But there are other ways to describe a good project, like social outputs, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the element we bring to the table is a social value. We're bringing veterans with a need to work in the environment to help them. So obviously the right tree in the right place is always important. We're looking at biodiversity, looking at all of the aspects of the project, but the gold standard exists outside of the UK. There's lots of different factors you've got to consider, just other than just putting the trees in the ground.
So if I could just add to that. So for us, we're essentially looking at winding the clock back to the last ice age, just after the last ice age. So we've got, I think it's something around 12% tree cover in the UK, which is the lowest in Europe, with the exception of Iceland. So if you look at Germany, Spain, and France, their tree cover is over 30%. In Scandinavia, it's over 60%. And if you consider that a quarter of those countries are in the Arctic, we would have been a mostly forested nation at one point.
Andy, these projects, some of them you're describing are massive. And when it comes to doing anything like that, what's your considerations around project design and the ins and outs of forestry? I mean, this is huge numbers you're talking about, and lots of people.
It is, and it's quite a complex process to start with. It's not as simple as taking a tree and putting it in the ground. When you go back to the project design, first and foremost, we've got to find the land. That is difficult. Obviously, there's agricultural land in the East Riding. There's competition for food. All of those considerations have got to be taken into place. We've also got archaeology, ecology checks that need to be done. We've got to consider all those aspects before you even put a spade in the ground. That's after finding the land. Once we've done that, we'll always hear the term the right tree in the right place. So obviously certain soil conditions, and we're looking at the provenance of the trees as well. So we're not bringing in trees from different locations. We want to make sure they grow. We need to get boots on the ground. We need to see what's growing around. We need to do an ecological site classification and look at what forest research technology will tell us will grow in that area. And we can use that tool to fast forward and see what will work in 50 years' time. with the climate change issue. And at the same time, we've got to write a project design document that needs to be approved by the Woodland Carbon Code. So all those factors need to be put into consideration and move at once in parallel, and not forgetting we need the trees. And there's such a demand for trees at the moment. Hence, we've gone and set up our own nursery and growing our own, because there's 50 million trees needed for the Northern Forest. The government mandate was 600 million trees. You want the right trees for your project, you've got to book them in advance. Now, what usually happens is poor quality trees can get sent out of around 20 centimeters. So anybody looking to develop a project of a large scale, my advice is always that once we know where the project is and what trees we're going to plant, book the trees. Let's get them grown so that they're actually at a height when we put them in the ground, they've got an advantage. So we've got to grow them in the nursery, harden them off outside, and rather than planting 20 to 40 centimeter trees, as we did recently at Burswick, we proved, Brian, didn't we? We planted 60 to 80s. We'd grown them on a year in the nursery. So they're at this height and I've got a greater start. And the reason for that is in years to come, you have something called monitoring, reporting and verification. Somebody will come along and audit the project to check the trees that we said in the project design are in the project and are actually growing, and they need measuring. So the better start we can give those trees, the more chance we've got of sequestering the carbon and trading those carbon credits or offsetting them.
It's an interesting position to be in that you've got, really, because you're kind of on the front line of things. Because you mentioned Brian there, Brian Sellers sat there from Corru. Between you, with your support and Brian's incredible energy, you've planted 9,000 trees, and now another, right, so 9,000 trees before the festival, and then raised money at an event during the festival to buy more, and have gone and planted them already as well before the end of the festival, which is pretty impressive. So you planted 800 this week from Humber Forest, yeah. Amazing. With the Green Task Force, yeah. I'm repeating what you're saying because you don't have a microphone right now. And we do have a microphone for Q&A, I'm assuming, which will probably be a good time to start passing it around. But yeah, so you've got all these projects going on. People might not realise that on the PATT site, on the Plant Trees Today Foundation site, one of the other events we had this week, which was the Life Skills Hub, working with young people doing in a forest school setting, learning forest skills, that's on your site. The permaculture garden for our CEC is on your site to grow food to give away across the road to people who come in. There's a lot going on that site. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, you're growing tens of thousands of trees to do the projects you're saying. That is interfacing with people talking to you about carbon credits, right? So that's the two worlds don't seem to quite meet, but you've got to deal with that clearly. What are the misconceptions about carbon credits from your perspective, stood there with the trees in your hand?
Do you want to start, Richard, or do you want me to?
I'll start. Yeah. So just to expand on what Andy was saying is that there's a misconception that it's sort of like the Wild West, when actually, if you look at, for example, here in the UK, everything's third-party inspected, certified, and validated. And these projects, they'll have an inspection at year 0, year 5, and then every 10 years. It could be for up to 100 years. And there's a carbon audit each time they come, as Andy was saying, based on the trees. There's also traceability on the seeds, where they all come from, all the way through the supply chain, through the nurseries and everything. So there's a lot of science and gold-plated. We back it up very well here in the UK. So the misconception, the first one is that this is sort of just have a go and whack some trees in the ground. It's actually very involved. It takes years of planning and permissions and so on. Thing there, carbon footprints. So for Highland Carbon, where we're in business to business, the companies are reporting to us on their carbon footprint and their reduction strategy and where they plan to get to over time. So I can see year on year the reductions they're making as they're buying fewer units, because they are actually reducing. And so they tend to program these things in because, for example, they might not be able to buy a whole fleet of buses that are electric in one go. They might program those in over 5 years or what have you. But that's planned in so they'll reach a point in future when there might be net zero 2040 or net zero 2050. But I think The good news is that it's happening at scale. There's so many companies doing amazing things, and there's making very little noise about it.
There's quite a few aspects there. If you go back a long time ago, I was based in Asia, and the term cowboys, the carbon cowboys were about. They were selling carbon that didn't exist. I remember a transaction from one of the Asian forests, it might have been in Indonesia, into Australia for $1 million Aussie dollars. And this was 2007 time. And since then, that was because forestry existed under the certified emissions regulations market. The other accreditation, the voluntary market, hadn't developed. It has now, and certainly in the UK, we've got the Woodland Carbon Code, which is quite stringent, and you can see everything goes into a market registry database. So for every ton, there is an assigned number in a database, and it's retired, so we can't get any double counting. But you come into an area, then the misconception is offsetting a permission to pollute? Well, in some respects, yes, it is. But in the voluntary market, you can't retire those greenhouse gas emissions necessarily against your regulatory compliance. So these companies are doing it because they feel the need to do it from a consumer element, and they're doing it for the goodness of the environment. And also it's great, what is ESG, CSR aspects for them. All of the companies around now, they're promoting it and getting mileage out of this, but they genuinely want to do things to help the environment.
So basically, there's good and bad practice, as there is in everything. And you're seeing a lot of good practice, which is really good to see. And that they are actually making those changes, as well as, in the meantime, accounting for where they're at now. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, can I give you an example? I think sometimes a lot of companies are not connecting the dots. They want to do it for those genuine environmental benefits, and they're not realizing, actually, instead of rushing to do this, let's take a step back, look at what your requirements are. And there are enough government grants out there and funding to support the trees. The work that's needed is to put the project design together under an accredited carbon code. So we can stack their funding with a government grant, and they can then own and retire the credits. Now, that's a conversation I'm having with quite a lot of companies, major national companies at the moment, and trying to bring some projects to the East Riding, because we've not had a massive project here yet. The biggest one was in North Yorkshire, was Broughton Hall, 300,000 trees. Richard's involved in some big projects in Scotland. My intention is to try and bring a flagship project, and I've got 3 major blue chip companies talking to me at the moment about carbon offset projects in the East Riding.
Okay, that's good to hear. Now, we have that microphone, and we have opportunity for questions from yourselves. Don't all stick your hands up at once. I'll go on then. Who wants to do a question now? Who wants to ask? Go in over there.
Right, yeah, that's really inspiring stuff from both of you. Thank you very much. Not just for the talk, but for the work you're doing. It's brilliant. What about the people that live in these areas where you're planting new forests? What happens to them when these projects get started?
Yeah, so initially, our name's Highland Carbon because we started in the Highlands. Incidentally, our office is in Yorkshire. So we do have a project in the Dales now. It's coming in. We're moving down the country a bit. But in these remote communities, we've got a project, for example, on Lewis. We've got them in the middle of, the Cairngorms and so on. There's very little full-time year-round employment for people. You have a lot of seasonal workers in ecotourism and hospitality and so on. The projects that we've been involved with, we've brought £3 million in private finance, and that has released £15 million in capital grants. That money then flows through the supply chain, and that's going to the people who are the tree nurseries. It goes to the people who are planting the trees, the forestry workers, the ecologists. There's a whole ecology sector, people putting access lanes in, deer fencing, which is temporary till the forests develop. So there's a whole green economy, and it is enormous. And I think they've really cracked it in Scotland. They've got some very big tree nurseries up there. If you look at in the UK, and part of the reason we focused up there to begin with is that's where all the biggest tree nurseries are. You get them in Northumberland and elsewhere, but it's that capacity is moving down the country, and as it does, you'll start to get scale here too. So the socioeconomic impacts are enormous. There's also benefits for well-being as the environment is improved, taken back to what it would have been like. People come to see the white-tailed eagles or the capercaillie or whatever it is that's in the landscape. And we do get involved with a number of educational initiatives that I won't go on about them, but there's 4 different ones we get involved with different higher learning institutions and projects for young people from disadvantaged communities. So there's that element. And then there's the whole sort of natural environment enhancement, reduction of flooding, flood mitigation and so on. So there's a whole range of social benefits which are quite significant.
Yeah, I think Richard's touched on most of them. What's not to like, to be perfectly honest. But you've got to look at the situation. We're not displacing people. We're enhancing the environment, not just for the planet, but for the people in it. Most of those spaces are community access, which comes back to exercise, being out in nature. Another thing that I noticed you touched on, David, was pulmonary conditions. And one of the discussions I know I'd had with Alan and one I'd had a long time ago with Fakan from Connexin about air pollution in the city is how can we actually plant trees which will help the pollution levels or divert the airflow in the city, which is actually affecting some of the green spaces. So it's a multi-layered benefit of planting the trees. I'll go back to my statement.
Can I just,
what's not to like?
If I could just add to that, because this is quite a specific point, echoing what Andrew said, our agreements with landowners forbid them from removing people from the landscape. They cannot clear crofters out. The crofters remain where they are. So that we're planting really on the marginal land, which is of no use to agriculture. So the farming continues, the other uses of the land continue. We're just enhancing the best bits, which were the wildest bits, if you like. Yes.
So we have a question from Phoenix.
I think what you're doing is amazing. One of the biggest things we really need to do is a mass tree planting program. And we've got a network of 20, 25 odd centres around the country. And one of the things we want to do is link with landowners to once a year, people from the centre go out and plant trees. And we'd love to link with various groups like yourselves. But my main question really is, how do you find the land or the landowners? That process, we wanted to link city centres with landowners. Do you talk to councils? Do you talk to big estates, big landowners, individuals? How do you go about identifying those bits of land and then linking up, your teams to go and plant there? And how's that process been for you? How can we accelerate and work together?
Part of the reason that we've focused initially on the top of the UK is because it was easiest there to do things at scale because there was large estates. So if I give you an example, we've got a project in Galloway and Dumfries, which is going to have over 2 million trees on one estate. And it's the only way we could do it. If we're thinking big and wanting to have, we're working there in a biosphere where we've got a Scottish Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve immediately adjacent. We've got a treble SI down the hill, a treble SI in the estuary, marine protected area. It's all in one big area, and then the Galloway forest. So we were thinking big. So for us, that's how we went about it. But we are starting to do some smaller projects around rivers. And that's where we're coming into Yorkshire and Lancashire and so on, where the long, skinny bits of land that aren't much use, but reduced pollution going in off cattle land, dairies and so on into the rivers.
I think you've got to separate out carbon projects just from woodland creation, because not every project, it will sequester carbon, but not every project is trying to trade carbon. So the larger scale projects, and I think the minimum really to be effective is 5 acres, but that's too small and certainly wouldn't be of interest to Richard, I don't think. So it's become, let's be honest, it's free trees if you're in certain areas. From the community forest teams are meant to be honest brokers. So we've got Woodland Trust offer, which give you 80% of the costs. You've got the England Woodland Creation offer, which can give you up to £16,800 per hectare, depending on the different values that can be brought into it. The community forests themselves have their own program if you're in a community forest area. So also under the countryside stewardship, there's grants for hedgerow, hedge laying and gapping up of hedgerow as well at the moment. So there's so much money being thrown at this at the minute. It's not necessarily, and I'm coming back to your question, it's about the communication, because it's free. So a landowner can get free trees and we come along, do all the paperwork and do all the planting. What's not to like? Come back to the same thing. What we're finding specifically in the East Riding, the Humber Forest team sit as part as East Riding Council. It's incestuous in this area. Each farmer knows the one other. So it's let's see how it goes. And I know we planted 9,000 trees at the Lungs of Burswick at the golf course. We also planted 9,000 trees at Andrew Smales' farm as a memory for his dad. And that's a local farmer that knows every other farmer around. And all of a sudden, next door neighbor is ringing me. So I'm getting calls to go and visit farms and talk to them. And they're falling off their chair. Really? It's free? Yes. You're staring a gift horse in the mouth and you don't actually have to do anything. We'll do it all for you. So it's working word of mouth. Now, we're from a generation that's learning about social media from our kids. Let's be honest. I don't use TikTok or Snapchat, or I don't use Facebook. You mentioned X or Twitter. You know, neither do farmers. They're old school. And you might remember this one, Bob Hoskins. You know, it's good to talk. They pick up the phone. I can tell from who's laughing who remembers Bob Hoskins. You know, it is a personal network, and I'm having this same conversation because I'm involved in a soil carbon project that we're bringing some technology to the UK on how to tackle that market. How do you get the message out to people who they don't really come out of the farm very often? You've got to go to them. However, the young farmers associations, they are using social media, so we've got to go to that demographic and spread the message. And eventually, I think we'll get them back in.
I would add to that just to say what we're doing. There's just one way of doing it, and we're doing a certain kind of project. But there'll be loads of events that farmers go to. You know, it's Country Landowner Association events, for example, and at county shows. And there's plenty of places where you can have a trade stand and meet people and offer, you know, to get some trees in their land. I think it'd be well received.
I think it's something we've all really got to focus on very, very fast, is getting mass tree planting programs going. We'd love to work with you and link up. And, you know, I think I read there's 3 things we need to push, which is tree planting, kelp around the edge of the seas absorbs a load of CO2. And the other one is hemp, which is really important. It absorbs 40 times as much CO2 as other places. But really massive respect for what you're doing. We're going to do a tree event soon in London where we're getting lots of tree planting groups together. If there's any way we can work together with these 20, 25 centres we've got, let's get the tree planting teams together and let's go for it. That'd be great. Brilliant stuff.
That's really appreciated. But I just want to track back to something as well, because there's such a desire to get these trees in the ground, and the pace at which they're doing it. Actually, they're not taking a step back and thinking, where is the right place to plant these trees? We're at risk of flooding. So instead of just putting trees in anywhere where they can get land, and that is the situation at the moment, should we not be considering where is the best place to plant these trees?
Strategic.
It is. And, you know, where are the flood zones? Where would be the riparian planting that would affect the flow of the water? That's the bit that we need to really be looking at seriously. And we're not, unfortunately, because we need to collect. I'm using the collective royal we. We're trying to find land to get the trees in the ground to hit the targets. Okay.
Well, there is going to be a presentation straight after lunch with Silvio Pirvu, where he'll be making a lot of that an awful lot easier using the European Space Agency satellites connection. So you can see in real time where to put these trees, so I need to make sure that you're talking to Silvio because that's what these events are about, is getting you guys together. And it's great that Phoenix is able to connect up the CECs with the country and everything else. Have we any more questions? Yes, we have. Helen was next, and then
thank you ever so much so far for the conversation. Potentially an unpopular sort of question maybe, and hopefully not. I've always sat at a position where I don't really like the idea of carbon offsetting, especially right now when we really need a lot of hard and fast carbon reduction immediately. Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, biodiversity is such an important part of it, and we're already in an ecological emergency. So there are a lot of challenges that we face. At what point for big organizations and for even small businesses would you suggest that they start to look at their offsetting? I mean, we have a carbon management plan in place, and we know that in the future we can get our emissions down so far, but at the end we are going to have to offset those last emissions. Should I be offsetting them now, so that those trees have time to grow and mature? Will it save me money in the long run to do that?
Shall I have a go? I'll have a go at that one. Yeah. So really, the conversation 5 years ago was that businesses should reduce first, and when they finished reduction, look at what's left. The conversation has moved, and now we say we don't have time for that anymore. So we have to do everything in parallel. So where companies are looking to hit a target of companies, or it could be councils or hospitals or schools or anything, looking to hit a target of say 2050, they have to secure the units in a certain time frame alongside the reductions to hit that target. And part of the reason for that in the UK is because it takes time for the trees to grow. So you have to plant them now so you get the benefit of the growth until 2050, so that the carbon is counting in that growth period. So if you're to wait now, let's say, reduce, and then when you get down to say 1% or 2% remaining, then offset, those trees wouldn't count to your 2050 goal because they'd be too late. So that's the balancing act that's happening at the moment. I would say, I think there's a misconception about companies will default to offsetting rather than reducing. And I'd want to talk to that point for a moment. So companies can switch energy providers really quickly, and that can take them from a major footprint to 80% reduction if they go to green energy. That can be the biggest, quickest thing they can do. You know, motion activated LED lights and various other things, you know, micro generation and so on. They can make major steps within 4 or 5 years. So the rate at which they are reducing, it happens fairly quickly when it comes to facilities. It gets harder when it comes to scope 2, where you're looking at transport, and scope 3 when it's supply chain. And that's where those things get a bit further down the line, because it's the expense of replacing a fleet of vehicles or what have you. But I would say we don't have time to muck about and wait and hesitate. We just got to crack on.
Hello, I'm going to come at it from a different angle. Look at the situation at the moment. We've got SECA, Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting. That is the government benchmarking companies today. Companies over 250 employees, £36 million turnover, 80 million profit, any two of those three. So the government is looking at what they're doing, and they have, by 2030, I think it is, have got to reduce. If they can't reduce, some of them can't, they've got to offset. Okay. The issue is from a forestry perspective, and I'm come back to your question, should you be offsetting? The issue from a forestry perspective is that we can never really fully offset a company's emissions. We bring all those other values, the biodiversity, the social value, etc. It's a good thing to do. But as we get to 2030, the government's got to turn the screw, because a carbon tax will be implemented on those big organizations. If we're to get to, and I know, Gwyn, you don't like the term net carbon zero, but if we get to a carbon positive position, well, they've got to turn the screw, and it's got to trickle down to the SMEs. Now, it's not going to happen in the next decade for an SME or an individual. It's not worth an individual offsetting for the future tax mitigation at all. You know, that's going to be 20 years down the line. The challenge that we face is that major organizations do not look at woodland carbon per se as such, because all CEOs are installed to look at shareholder value. So they're looking at profit today. The carbon tax is purported to be £100. Let's pick a figure. At the moment, under the government's carbon guarantee, I think the last trade was around £21, £21 to £24. That was a good government guarantee to buy your carbon, but you could sell it to somebody else at a higher price. Now, the cost of establishment is lower than that. It has to be, otherwise this doesn't work. So when I've gone into all of the major organizations here and said, you should be considering this, because you're going to get hammered with a carbon tax in the future, and it might be £100. And if we're not hitting our net carbon zero targets, the government's turning the screw and it'll go up. Do you not think it's sensible to invest in something like this? They don't care. Accountants are looking at counting the beans today. They're looking at shareholder value, not stakeholder value. And they're certainly not looking at the future 10 years from now, where their profits are going to be hammered by a carbon tax. So look over the parapet, wake up, smell the coffee, and come and talk to us.
Could I expand on that from a slightly
Very
different,
quickly, because we have 2 more questions to come.
I'll be very quick. it's affecting the real economy for these businesses, because there are pension funds that are divesting of companies because they're not hitting their carbon reduction targets. There's big companies where if their suppliers aren't hitting their target, they're switching. So it's all become an entire ecosystem of companies having to hit a mark to be able to do business with their customers. So it's having a real effect on business.
We have 2 more questions, starting with Alan down here.
So a lot of your discussion's been about like carbon offset and sort of the CSR emissions or obligations of companies to try and get to net zero. I just think about like climate adaptation, the role of trees in that. So for people that are not from around here, we have the Raywell Valley, which is kind of where I live, which brings in all the water off the chalk wolds and channels it all into Hull, which is built on clay, which is why most of the city was flooded in 2007. There's been a lot of investment in heavy engineering solutions to mitigate flooding Hull, which are very expensive and very carbon intensive themselves. Yet the Raywell Valley is still a bare valley of mostly farmland. There's mud runoff. You look at the ditches around there. Whenever it rains, the filthy brown with all the runoff. Can we tap into funding from not just the Environment Agency or perhaps local authorities, but even organisations like the Association of British Insurers to go, do you know what? If you wooded the valley, it would probably be a lot cheaper than building these flood lagoons, provide biodiversity, and probably offset a lot of the flood claims as well. So do we think there's a role in maybe trying to secure funding for adaptation as much as offsetting?
Can I take that one? 100% yes, and the money is there already. What we need to do is find the landowners and go back to the mapping and find the right place to mitigate those issues. So catch up with us afterwards. We'll put you in the right direction, because there's government funding to do this now without approaching the Environment Agency.
We'll see if we can help. I know 3 people, not just on the stage in the room, who can also chip into that conversation and support it as well. Question there?
I have 3 questions. The first one is on sustainability. What are you doing to make sure that the big companies, especially the retailers and the manufacturers who are producing the items, single-use items, which end up destroying the environment and the biodiversity and ecological, all that kind of stuff? What are you doing in terms of creating awareness and getting commitment from these major supermarkets and manufacturers? The other question is about creating awareness, especially for the young people, in terms of looking into it, in terms of celebrating, taking commitment and responsibility for the environment, not only for now and in future. Like, for example, encouraging the parents that when the child is born, plant a tree. When the child celebrates 12 years, plant a tree. When the child reaches 18, celebrate a tree. And at the 50 years, celebrate a tree. That way, they will be looking after those trees and creating sustainability, as you say. The other question I want to ask is about whether you're having some conversation or discussion with the housing companies and the planning permission, because there's a lot of houses that are being built all over the country, and it's high time that they embrace environmental commitments in everything they are doing. Some of them are doing, but there are certain things that they are not incorporating in it. And some of them, they still have the modern slavery within the supply chain, which has in relationship with destroying the environment as well. Thank you.
Okay,
I can take 2 of them very quickly.
Go for it.
The third one, in Hull particularly, there is a supplementary planning agreement for developers where they are required to plant 3 trees for every house that's built. I'm not sure if that still is in existence, but they do put money into an S106 fund that are meant to go into these areas. So all housing developers have to contribute to the local authority. How that money is spent is up to the local authority, not the developer. The first question was what are we doing about the sustainability issue? I think that's not our place. You know, at the end of it, we're down the value chain. We plant trees. People will advocate sustainability issues, not necessarily where we sit in this sector. The second question was
to do with young people involved with planting trees.
That's a really important point, and certainly from my position, I'll go back to Attenborough's comments about how can you look your children, your grandchildren in the eye and say you knew about this and did nothing. We chatted last night, Gwyn, about it. We operated in Thailand. We had a tree nursery. Had 10,000 kids go through that tree nursery, planting trees in Khao Yai National Park. So we have in the past tried to educate the kids. In the UK, there are lots of other organisations doing that, and it is so important. We've got life skills on our site at the moment. If we can get children involved, then we should. It's an active way. What we do, volunteering, getting kids out and families out, is a way of doing quite a few things at the same time, tackling a few things.
I can speak very quickly to that final question, which is about packaging and such. Even though we're not a pressure group, we have influence because we've got partnerships that we set up. So we essentially proactively try to find companies who are doing the right thing. So we're working with companies in new energy arena, the packaging and various other arenas. If we come alongside them and help them to succeed, then that's the influence we can bring. In our own sustainability issues, I think tree guards is one that we're wrestling with. There's a lot of review about that because, you know, the default ones are plastic, and there's some sheep wool fiber ones coming through and some other things. So we're watching the price on those to see when they become market ready, when they have the scale.
On that point, sorry, there's a forest plastics working group that operates, that's looking into this. There is no tree shelter at the moment that has stood the test of 3 years. The sheep's wool one hasn't worked. It's £3 each. So when we're looking at pricing a project, it's just not cost effective. So unfortunately, all of those companies that promote themselves as having a biodegradable shelter, they're photodegradable, so they're breaking down and the plastic is still in the soil. So we're stuck with the situation at the moment, and I'm having conversations at a senior level engaging veterans to collect the tree shelters. So we're stuck with the plastic, but we can actually recycle it and reuse it. Tubex are running a program at the moment. It's quite cheeky that you pay them to collect their own shelters and then they use the plastic in their new product. That's a smart business move. But we found out that we can actually collect those shelters. The problem is we've got to break them down into particles because you're transporting thin air around the country. So we've got to chip it into a voluminous product to take into the places to recycle it.
Okay, folks, that is all the questions we've got time for. Thank you for your questions, everybody who's asked. Thank you very much to Richard Clarke and to Andy Steele for taking those questions and explaining a lot. I almost know what it's all about now. Thank you for that.